Hi, good day. My name is Adeleke-Adedoyin. I'm a cloud solution architect for Microsoft. Today, I'm going to build out an Azure Kubernetes services cluster that we're going to use for later demos. We're going to build the Azure Container Service Cluster for 4 friends, Fifi and Friends, Node, JavaScript, .NET, and PHP. We're also going to use the Azure Container Registry. And when that's all done, we'll be able to look at our cluster and see our 4 friends. In the portal, we can navigate to the top right of the screen and click on the Cloud Shell feature. The Cloud Shell feature is a command line prompt experience that you get in the browser. In this situation is set up for Bash. In the Bash command prompt, I'll export some variable names that I'll need to use at some later point. I'll use those variable names in my subsequent commands to create the resource group, which I just did. And I'll use it to create an Azure Container Registry. We need to go ahead and make sure that we have secure access to our Azure resources, specifically our Azure Container Service Cluster. We need to create a service principal. Its service principal is nothing but a service account for the resources that we'll be connecting to. So we'll set up the Azure Service Principal. And on creation of our Azure Container Service, we'll reference that service principal we just created to make sure that we can securely connect to other resources. In this case, specifically Azure DevOps services, pipeline to the cluster, and from the cluster to the Azure Container Registry. Give it a moment, but it'll take a few minutes for your cluster to be spun up. Once your cluster is up and running, you can go ahead and use the AKS get credential command. What this does is allows you to manage your cluster using kube control. A little note here, kube control is already installed in the Azure Cloud Shell instance. If you are running this from your local Mac or PC, you might have to go ahead and install kube control. We already have our AKS cluster set up, but we need to make sure that we can manage and update it. To do that, we need to install Helm, which is an open source packaging tool that helps install and manage life cycles of Kubernetes application. We'll use kube control to create a service account called Tiller in the namespace kube-system. What we need to do now is to assign a cluster role binding to the service account Tiller. In this case, we'll assign it a cluster role of cluster admin to the Tiller service account that we just created. Seems like we got an error. There's an unknown flag service account, and that's a typo on my part, so we'll fix that. Give it a swirl again. Since we can have many applications in a Kubernetes cluster, we'll use kube control to create a specific namespace called Fifi and Friends. This we'll use to deploy our 4 friends in our cluster. As a recap, remember our 4 friends would be 4 different languages, which would be .NET, Node.js, Go, and PHP. Likewise, we'll similarly create a cluster role binding for a default view, giving it a cluster role of view. We need to reference Fifi and Friends namespace. Oops, I got an error there, another typo on my path. I'll have to specify the default. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my Azure Container Service Cluster Service Principal Profile Client ID and store it in a variable called Client ID. As you can see, we have that ID now from the AKS cluster. I'll do the same thing for my Azure Container Registry to make sure that I get its ID. And we have that. The idea here, or the motivation here, is to assign the correct permissions from the cluster to the Azure Container Registry, which we'll use in our deployment in subsequent videos. So that's what I'm doing with the Azure role assignment. Seems I had an error, so I corrected that, and we have the service principal set up for the AKS cluster to Azure Container Registry. We need to make sure now that our Azure DevOps services can actually manage our Azure Container Registry. So we're going to create another role-based access control and generate its password that we're going to save in registry password. We will use this in subsequent videos because the idea and the motivation here is to automate deployments through Azure DevOps services. There are actually 3 roles here: ACR push, pull, and owner. I need a push for this one. Let's recap what we just did. We did a lot of things here. We essentially got variables that we're going to use in subsequent videos for our release pipeline. We got our registry password, we got the ACR login, and we also got the ACR registry name. So what did we just do? We created an Azure Kubernetes cluster for our 4 friends, Fifi and friends, and we made sure that Azure DevOps services can connect securely using RBAC to these resources. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video. Bye.